go over some commonly asked questions about parasites for dogs and cats. My first question is, how often should my pet be checked for worms?
You should have your pet tested for intestinal parasites at least once a year. If they've had previous problems with worms, then I'd have them tested more often, probably 2 times a year.
Okay. And how would I collect that sample and bring it in for testing?
Yeah, usually it's not too difficult to get a good sample for testing at the veterinary clinic. With cats, it's pretty easy. You can go into the litter box and you want to clean out the old bowel movements, and then when your pet has another fresh sample, go ahead and collect that. You need about a tablespoon amount, and it can have litter on it because that will filter out during the testing process. Just put it in a Ziploc bag, double baggie it, label it, put it in the refrigerator until you can get it into your veterinarian. In dogs, it's simple too, because you can just go outside and same thing with the little Ziploc baggie, just collect about a tablespoon worth of their fecal matter and double bag it, label it again, and keep it refrigerated until you can get into the veterinary clinic.
And how old should my puppy or kitten be before deworming them?
Well, most breeders will deworm the puppies and kittens before we see them at the veterinary clinic. So they'll very often start at 3 weeks of age. On the first examination at the clinic, we typically will deworm that day, and then every 2 weeks until the patient is 4 months old. We're pretty rigorous about the deworming schedule because we don't want humans to catch some of these worms that we can contract from our cats and our dogs. And so we just want to be really safe with that.
Okay. And what are roundworms?
Roundworms are parasite worms that can attack the small intestines of dogs and cats. And during their migration cycle, they also go through the lungs. And so they can cause a lot of disease, and they can take the nutrients out of the dogs and the kitties and the puppies, and so we want to make sure we eliminate that.
Okay. And what do they look like?
Roundworms are usually 4 to 5 inches long. They're white, and they look like little pieces of spaghetti. They can sometimes be found in the stool after a puppy or kitten has a bowel movement, especially if they're very heavily loaded with those roundworms. They'll sometimes roll up into a tiny ball, and they'll be very wiggly.
And what would the symptoms be if my puppy had roundworms?
Yes, very often puppies that have roundworms will present with a very rounded pot belly. They'll have diarrhea, sometimes with some mucus and blood in it. And sometimes, again, they'll just pass the worms right out in the bowel movement. Sometimes the pets will have a dull hair coat, and sometimes they'll be a little bit thin because of the worms.
Okay. And how do animals get tapeworms?
Tapeworms typically go through an intermediate host. So dogs and cats can contract them by ingesting fleas that are on their body. And then in the flea is the immature stage of the tapeworm. The other intermediate host that's common is a rodent. So if like a farm cat's outside eats a mouse, they can contract tapeworms that way as well.
Okay. And do tapeworms and roundworms, how do they differ in the way that they look?
Yeah, they do look different because tapeworms are much smaller and shorter than roundworms. They're usually a 1/2 inch long, and they're white. They'll look like a little piece of rice kind of moving. And very often if a dog has a bowel movement and you looked closely at it, you would see these white little segments moving on top of the surface of the bowel movement. Sometimes they'll come out of the rectum and just be right around their bottom, and you'll see little dried pieces of these segments around the fur. And sometimes when they really dry out, it'll look like a little brown or beige sesame seed. So you can look at the fur around their bottom to sometimes tell if your pet has tapeworms.
Okay. And what are heartworms?
Heartworms are worm-like parasites that infect the right side of the heart of dogs, typically. And they can sometimes block the large vessels in the heart and lead to heart disease and even death.
Okay. And what role do mosquitoes play in heartworms?
It's a good question. Mosquitoes are part of the life cycle of the heartworm. So a mosquito they can transfer the disease from one dog to another. So a mosquito, if it bites one dog with immature, they're called microfilaria. Those microfilaria go into the mosquito, and then they mature, and then the mosquito flies to another dog, bites that dog, and will inject the larva into the second dog.
Okay. Okay. And how would I get my pet tested for heartworms?
To get your dog tested for heartworms, it requires just a small blood sample that's sent to the lab, or it's run at your veterinary clinic. So you would take your pet to the veterinarian to have that performed.
And if I started preventative medication, what age should I start that at with my puppy?
Yeah, that's a good question. You can start it at 4 or 5 months of age, but you definitely want to start it right before 6 months of age.
Okay. And can I get heartworms from my dog?
That's also a very good question. Typically no. Typically no, because we tend to be immune to it, but it is possible. There have been some cases cited in humans that have contracted heartworm.
Okay. And if I decided to put my pet on heartworm prevention, do they need to be tested first?
Yeah, it's best to have your pet tested for heartworms to make sure that they're negative before you start on the preventative, and we'll typically do that from age 6 months and above.
Okay. And is it possible to get hookworms from my pet?
Yeah, we would not contract the intestinal form of hookworms like a dog would contract, but what can happen sometimes is if a dog that has hookworms, let's say they walk across a sandy beach and they have a bowel movement, in the bowel movement, if there are hookworm eggs, if they stay in there long enough, those eggs can larvate. So they'll turn into these little larvae that'll kind of go into the sand. Then if you were to walk by there with bare feet, these larvae have an affinity to the warmth of our feet, and they'll go up and kind of attached to the underside of our feet, and they can go into our skin and then cause disease. So sometimes beaches have signs, no dogs allowed, because they don't want to have that happen.
Okay. And what are the signs of a whipworm infection?
Whipworm infections in dogs can cause bloody, mucousy diarrhea, and sometimes it'll even cause anemia, pot belly. It'll make them be sick.
And is it difficult to get rid of whipworms in the environment?
Yeah, thankfully whipworms are not too common in this area. I do see it occasionally, and yes, it is hard to get rid of them. When I was in veterinary school, I remember our instructors teaching us that short of a blowtorch, it's hard to get rid of them in the environment. So preventative measures are important. Sometimes I'll recommend to not take your dog to areas where there's lots of dogs heavily occupying a space, because sometimes those are the areas where your dog might contract a worm or parasite like whipworms. In the environment, in order to prevent whipworms, if your dog has the bowel movement, it's important just to pick the bowel movement up quickly so that nothing does infect the environment.
Okay. That ends our section today on the parasites. Thank you, Dr. Vinta.
You're welcome.